All right. So I'm Will Weeder. I'm one of the Land Model Working Group co-chairs, along with Rosie Fisher. And then Kristen, Abby, and Gretchen are the Biogeochemistry Working Group co-chairs. And thank you all for coming. I think we have 140 people as of Friday that registered for the meeting. And almost half of those are graduate students and postdocs. So thank you if you're a graduate student and postdoc for coming. And thank you to your advisors for either having you in the room or helping us join online. I think that kind of engagement is really important for the working group. And then we had over 40 requested talks. So it's exciting to see that kind of engagement continue with the working group. So usually it's kind of hard to have this meeting without kind of thinking about the broader context that we're working in. And this picture is incredible, but it actually doesn't do it justice to the number of flowers that were just going off in this meadow on a backpacking trip that my family and I did this summer. And usually at this point in the meeting, I would show the flowers or the flower of the CGD Code of Conduct. That's not something that we're showing right now, but I think the message for what was on those flower petals is still worth talking about, and it's still worth having these expectations. So think about these things kind of during our meeting. And we're going to have a lunch discussion on Tuesday in the Damon Room and on Google Meet, where we'll talk about kind of belonging and engagement and ways that we want the working group to kind of continue working as a group in, I think, what are kind of challenging times. And so Eric will say a little bit more about this. So Eric's going to organize it. It's totally optional. But I think it'll be a worthwhile discussion. And for those of you who are joining online, Elizabeth will send a link to that meeting probably this afternoon or maybe tomorrow morning. There we go. So a couple other goals that I have for the meeting. I think it's important that we get to share our science. I'm really excited to hear about some of the new things that people are talking about. I'm always struck by the kind of wealth of expertise that the working group has on a whole bunch of different topics. And so I'd encourage you to seek out advice and suggestions and ideas from people in the room who have more or less experience than you. I think it's really important that we start communicating our priorities, especially as we look beyond CMIP7, which sounds a little preposterous right now, but I'm looking forward to looking beyond CMIP7 before too long. And so we can discuss some of our short-term goals, which in the short term is CMIP7, and in the long term, and then longer term, where do we want to be heading? And then also really just appreciate the community and collaboration that we have. I think again, this work, like the working group, to me brings me a lot of energy, and I love hearing the work that you all are doing, and so I think it's important that we kind of appreciate that community and the collaborative spirit that we have. So along those lines, happy hour today. I guess I mentioned this already, and then dinner tomorrow. Yeah, we can continue those conversations outside of NCAR. And then this is just a reminder. At this meeting we always present the Slater Award. So Drew was a member of the Land Model Working Group community who brought a deep dedication, understanding, and joy to his research, and it was really infectious the way that Drew kind of creatively applied the model, and then also was very critical and engaging with the work that we were doing. And so we offer the Andrew Slater Award to graduate students and postdocs who have used creative applications of the model, presented significant model development activities, and identified major issues and biases, and also have a high level of engagement with the working group. So just a thank you to Drew and to his family for making this award possible. And then also a shout out to a pretty distinguished group of people who have won the award. So Linnea was our winner last year. We'll get to hear from her tomorrow, but a number of these people are still engaged with the working group. And it's exciting to see so many of these faces return year after year. Okay. So I think the focus of the working group is really still on these three questions. It's like, where are we going to put the carbon? How do we grow the food, and how do we have enough? Like, how do we maintain our water supplies? And I think those kind of three main focus areas are things that'll serve us well moving forward. And so towards that end, I want to talk about some of the science highlights that the working group has had over the past year. introduce some new model features and capabilities. There's a bunch of new faces in the room and also new faces online. And so I want to kind of make people aware of some of the new things that are available.
I am
and then I'd
for
like to finish
land
today
modeling
with a discussion about
Okay,
the new directions that we have. And this is just maybe a bit of a warning for folks online. I really do, like, we have so many people that are participating online today. I want to encourage that participation. And at least for this talk, I'm going to ask that the first question come from online. This is just my latest way of trying to get more online engagement. So if you're online, you're on the spot, and be thinking about questions or discussion items for the end of this talk. Okay, so the big thing, at least that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, is getting the land model working, the land model ready for CESM3 and for CMIP7. And so you might think, like, what does this have to do with Colorado Springs? I was in Colorado Springs on Friday with my daughter. She's going to be at Colorado College next year, and I'm not going to touch the screen. But this is the dorm that I went to when I was a freshman at Colorado College. And during that year, they were negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, which is kind of, to me, it was poignant. It's like, oh my gosh, like now I'm here and we're talking about CMIP7, not in that dorm room where my daughter's going to be. So I don't know, it's I would say not a drag getting the model ready for CMIP, but it kind of feels like a grind sometimes. And so this kind of just gave me some pause, like, oh wow, this is like really cool what we're doing. And it really does take everyone to kind of pull their weight and get ready to do this big thing and get the model ready and hopefully looking decent for CMIP7. So in terms of, ooh, that looks pretty bad. In terms of the coupled model, these are just like, what does the climate of the coupled model look like right now? These are some recent simulations where the Arctic is colder in the winter, which is good. Hopefully that means we'll have a decent permafrost extent, but it's also pretty wet, which is a challenge because when the Arctic's too wet, we end up building up lots of snow, and when you have lots of snow, then it doesn't melt, and then it's hard to grow plants. That's not happening right now, but we do have this kind of appropriately cold but wet Arctic. I should say the blue is CSM2 PI control, and the red is the recent CSM3 development branch. So I'm not too worried about the Arctic climate right now. The tropics are more concerning. So it's really hot and it's really dry in the tropics. And so what's shown on the lower left-hand side is just a climatology of monthly temperatures and precip. And you can kind of see how, like, you know, we've got a 3-degree, 4-degree bias in Amazonian temperatures in the dry season, and it's really, really dry. So you can see that here. This distribution of precip is not looking very good in the coupled model as of last week. As of Thursday, things are starting to look better. That run kind of was running over the weekend, and I didn't have time to include any diagnostics in this talk. But as of Thursday, the ocean model seems to have figured out what was wrong, hopefully. And I'm optimistic that if anyone sticks around for the ocean model working group on Thursday, Gustavo will have good news about what the ocean model looks like. Anyway, this is where we've been, though, for the last several months, I would say, is with these pretty persistent biases where the Sahel is really, really wet and the Amazon is really, really dry. And the color bar here from the diagnostics package is really confusing because this is precip differences, or precip differences between the CSM3 development and the PI control, the CSM2 PI control. Okay, so that's kind of broad strokes what climate looks like. It's largely, I think, because of El Nino. I hadn't really spent a ton of time looking at these Hofmuller plots before, but basically you can see in the observations that you get the red is El Nino and the blue is La Nina, and they're in the observations and in CESM2, there's kind of this nice transition with about a 12-month lag between an El Nino and a La Nina. In CESM3, the same 121 development branch, the El Nino is lasting too long, and then similarly, the La Nina is persisting for too long. So there's just this kind of like offset in the lag, and our sea surface temperatures are staying too warm, which you can kind of see in the lower right-hand corner. So again, I think these biases are hopefully getting corrected as of the latest tag from the ocean model. But you'll have to come back here on Thursday to see for sure where that sits. Okay. These climate biases in the model then kind of present some interesting challenges for Linea and the rest of the PPE team who are trying to calibrate the model offline and then put our best calibration in to coupled model space. And it's sort of prompted this discussion about whether we need to have different calibrations for online and offline for coupled and uncoupled versions of the model. These are, coupled model is top left-hand corner. Ooh, I do have a pointer. Nope. Oh, look at that. Okay, so coupled model, you can see where these preset biases really cause problems with LAI in the tropics, whereas the offline version that Linea is calibrating has much kind of more reasonable LAIs. So it's prompted this discussion in the working group, like, do we need to have different calibrations for coupled and uncoupled? Again, I'm optimistic that if we kind of fix these El Nino and preset biases, that won't be necessary, but I think that's something that's still an open discussion about whether we want to do that. And again, the focus here is on creating a coupled model with an interactive carbon cycle so that we can run do emissions-driven scenarios for the deck and CMIP experiments. And so even though it's a little, I don't know, intellectually unsatisfying to have different calibration for different configurations of the model, if the high level thing that we're trying to do is have a reasonable historical carbon cycle and kind of an appropriate evolution of CO2 in the atmosphere and CESM3, it's something that we're kind of talking about needing to think about. Yeah, I guess that's what I'll say there. We can talk more about it at the end if folks are interested. And so all of this, my head is totally swimming with the number of simulations and experiments that we've tried to do both online, so land only I cases, coupled B cases, and then AMIP style F cases. There's a whole bunch of GitHub pages that we're kind of using to track these simulations. So the land model working group dev page, CESM dev, and AMWG dev pages have just a host of information and resources there. There's links to diagnostics as well as discussions that people are having about the kind of status of all of these simulations. And the way that we're putting these together, if you're familiar with GitHub, issues in GitHub correspond to simulations that we're doing. And so in creating the issue, then we also kind of spell out how the simulation was done. And there's, if you're interested in replicating some of these cases, you can also go back and look at what comp sets we're using, what version of the code we're using. And it hopefully will allow us to both track and repeat our science a little bit more easily. So this slide deck will be available after the presentation, and the links are all live. So you can, if you can't remember LMWG dev, you can click on the link and find it. So there's lots of stuff there, and I encourage folks to interact as much as they're interested on GitHub. Okay, there's been a ton that's happened in the last 6 months, 12 months in terms of highlights. And so the most recent tag that we have is CTSM 5.3, the kind of official release tag of the 5.3. The 5.3 tag came out just a couple of weeks ago, I think, Sam, that-ish, January. In that tag, there's some minor updates to surface data sets and corrections from 5.2, which was the previous latest release, where we updated all the surface data sets. In that update, though, to 5.2 to 5.3, the old surface data sets are no longer compatible with the new version of the code because of some minor changes to the glacier, how we're handling the glacier model. And so if you want to run with the latest data sets, you need to get the latest tag from the development branch. And one of those things that's on there is Git FlexiMod. Yep, go ahead, Sam. Or the latest release, yeah. Those aren't very far apart at this point. So Git FlexiMod is another just switch to the workflow. You no longer type in manage externals. You do the skit fleximod thing instead. It's a little bit faster and a better way to manage the modules that we bring in. So things like fates and other modules that are used for running CLM. We've fixed time on the history variables. So if you've got a Python script that has a fixed time function because you opened up your monthly history files and they always start with February, that's no longer something you have to do. But it also is a little bit tricky if you're comparing a new run and an old run where time is handled differently. Just for this transition stage, you need to kind of be aware of that. There's a few other fixes to time that you can check out on the CTSM repository. We're just kind of improving how we handle time, which is nice. It's like time management and model space. The CN matrix is something that we've talked about for years, and now it's actually on by default and easier to use. So that's there. The PPE team's been using that for a while. Now everyone else gets to use it too. The Fates comp set can now be run with transient land use, which is something that Charlie will talk about, although that's off by default. It's another capability that we have. We've added this CAM7 to land tuning mode, which is just a software feature that hopefully makes everyone's life easier as we move forward. And then we're also providing new initial condition files from CrewJRA. So CLM5, kind of the default forcing data set was GSWP3, and everything was kind of based around GSWP3. That data set stops in 2014, and so we decided it wasn't very useful to get us up to present day. And so we've switched to CrewJRA, thanks to Adriana and Sean and others who put together the CrewJRA data set from Trendy so that we can run it. I'll talk a little bit more about CrewJRA in a bit. And then excess ice is turned on, which is exciting because I think that was work that Hannah did when she was a postdoc like 12 years ago. And it's on by default now, which is great. So it's exciting to see some of these like long tail projects coming in. So some science changes that are also in. There's a new dust model from Danny. He'll talk more about dust, I think later on today, and a couple papers from him. We've switched the snow thermal conductivity to STURM 97. I think last year at this time we were talking a lot about dead Arctic vegetation and problems with permafrost, and the STURM scheme seems more appropriate for snow thermal conductivity, so that's on by default. Crop calendars have been informed by some work that Sam Rabin has done. That's also on main now, as well as explicit air conditioning from the urban model. The urban model kind of keeps getting better and cooler, literally cooler now that they can have air conditioning, which is exciting. There's updates to Megan for BVOCs, so anyone who's interested in atmospheric chemistry. We could actually use some help with this one because this new Megan model is turned on and it's giving us different answers. I don't know anything about secondary organic aerosols. Or terpenes or anything else. Anyway, there's updates to Megan and it's changing answers. There's a new fire model from Peng Li that's calibrated to CrewJRA and also to GFED5 burned area. So it's going to burn a lot more than the old version of the fire model did because GFED5 has higher burned area than the old fire model. There's a new temperature function for nitrogen fixation, which is off for now, but by next week will be turned on by default from Tom Bitnerovich, as well as PPE-informed parameter updates for CrewJRA that are changing every couple of weeks. Lenny is an expert at making new suggestions for parameter files, and it's pretty cool to see how this is moving our calibration ahead really rapidly. And Lenny, I'll talk some more about that tomorrow. Tomorrow? Yeah. Okay. So a little bit on DATM options. So for for CLM5, we had CrewNSEP and GSWP3 were the kind of two supported DATM options that we had. Those are no longer being updated. CrewNSEP had kind of a host of other problems. We didn't even use the long wave out of it. And so for CLM6, I'm suggesting that we use CrewJRA as our default. That's what Trendy uses. I don't know what the plan is for the JRA part since JRA is no longer being updated. I don't know what Trendy's going to do next year, but at least for now, we've got, from 1901 to 2023, so I think it's a little bit more useful. One of the problems with Trendy is that there's no data over Antarctica, and so like the SMILE program or the SMILE project was using crew JRA land initial conditions, but we didn't have any data over Antarctica, so that when they throw that in the coupled model, it's not good to initialize with NANs over Antarctica or interpolating from nearest grid cells over Antarctica. So that's a problem. We fixed that by just pasting in GSWP3 over Antarctica for crew JRA, so now we can at least generate initial conditions over Antarctica. It's a little bit less than ideal. And I know there's a lot of interest in using ERA5, which I think long-term might be a good solution for us. GoCon and others in the ocean group have some pretty serious misgivings about ERA5, at least for ocean initializations. And GoCon was pretty firm on not wanting to even entertain this idea. That said, I talked with Meg last week, and I know that the SPAT group is quite keen on using ERA5 for land initializations. So there is, I think if there's enough interest in getting ERA5 up and running and evaluating it, that would be great. I don't have the bandwidth to do it right now. But if that's something that the working group wants, we can uncross ERA5 from this list moving forward. Anyway, so in the short term, crew JRA is our default. We're still going to have GSWP3 around. You can have comp sets that run with GSWP3. But I will say that they're pretty different climates, even though they're both, sort of the best interpretation of reality over the last 120 years. They're pretty different, and the model calibrations that you need to get sensible land calibrations are different between the two. So we're putting all our eggs in the crew JRA basket for now. And Linnea and the rest of the PPE team have some pretty slick tools, though, that if people want to calibrate the model for different DATM options, that's something we can help you with. I can't help you. Linnea can maybe help you. So here's what the kind of latest land model, land-only runs look like. These are our maximum LAIs for each PFT, each of the 16 default PFTs. Some of the biases that we've been trying to address are getting C4 grasses. Ironically, in CLM5, it was really hard to kill the C4 grasses. In CLM6, it's been really hard to keep them alive, but this new calibration looks pretty good for C4 grasses. We also had pretty high biases of LAI in needle-leaf evergreen temperate trees and broadleaf evergreen tropical trees that have been brought down quite a bit in these latest runs. But you'll also notice that our evergreen tropical trees are dying in savanna regions, which is sort of interesting. So there's some additional challenges there of things we want to work on. C3 grasses are really hard to calibrate. So I think Team CSU is going to help us think about grasses maybe a little bit. I'm not sure how much we can help with C4 and C3 grasses, but these two PFTs have been pretty challenging. And right now, C3 grasses are totally going nuts in places that are relatively wet. And not living very well in places that are kind of dry. So we still have some more challenges, but at least like on average, I think we're doing pretty well with the kind of LAI calibration at a PFT level in these latest runs. And kind of an interesting result that happened as you go from a GSWP3 forest run of CLM53 to a crew JRA forest run with CLM53 to then this latest calibration is because we're addressing some of the mid and high latitude biases in LAI, you get better relationships between surface temperature and GPP. So you can kind of see what was pretty high biases. This pointer is wild. Pretty high biases and cooler kind of terrestrial domains here has really gone away with these latest runs. And so it's kind of a, we're calibrating to LAI, but we're getting better GPP and these better functional relationships with temperature because of it. Okay, some other features. We've talked about Neon for a little while now, and so we've had this run Neon script that was available to kind of download Neon data. We'd provide defaults, biogeochemistry, initial conditions, and then observations that you could use to compare to with Neon. We've expanded that into Plumber. So Plumber 2 sites are a whole bunch of Ameriflux, FluxNet, kind of a whole collection of, I think it's 170 tower sites. And so instead of having run Neon, we just have this generic run towers capability. So these are supported tower sites that we're providing all the DATM data to run single point simulations with. For Plumber 2, where the default is for SP simulations, and we're assuming that those are, you have to do your own spin up. So you're starting from a cold start, and you've got to kind of figure out the best way to spin up the model. This is something that's we need to support better, but it just came to the main development branch a week or two ago, and so we don't have any documentation on running Plumber sites, and we need to work on kind of some of our documentation and support for this. But the capability's there, so if folks are interested in running Plumber sites, that's a possibility now. The other difference between Neon and Plumber, with Neon, you can just download the observational data directly from Neon to evaluate the model. With Plumber, there's some post-processing that has to happen, and you have to feed it through modelevaluation.org or me.org. So a slightly different workflow, but a huge thanks to Tegan and Megan, who did a lot of the software work for this, and then Donica and Gordon, who were helped lead the Neon project, and then Sam Levis, Sam Rabin, Adriana, and Eric, who have worked on different parts of this design. I get to do a little bit of my own science, not very much anymore, but when I do, I like to still play with Mimics. So Mimics is a microbial explicit soil biogeochemical model that I've been working with for a while. It's been in CLM for probably a year, but it's been a struggle to spin it up. And so part of what I've been working on is Sam Levis helped put Mimics into CLM. And by doing that, we get the vertical resolution that CLM provides, and kind of some interesting opportunities to look at plant soil feedbacks with this microbial explicit model. It's a feature that'll be in CLM6, but it'll be off by default, and likely only really usable for single point runs, and that's because of the spin up problem. But somewhat serendipitously, Samar, who was at Oxford and now in Japan, was on a paper with me and then reached out, was like, hey, can I help with the spin up problem? And since then he's reached out to Keith Lindsay and is interested in helping the ocean model spin up their ocean biogeochemical tracers using this Anderson acceleration approach. And so with the help of Andrew Wilson, who at the time was in Oxford, now he ironically lives in Boulder and works in private consulting, they put together this Anderson acceleration that's working right now in single point cases for CLM. And so this is just showing for a whole bunch of different soil layers at Bartlett Experimental Forest, which is a Neon site. We're able to kind of increase the acceleration. The solid lines are the Anderson acceleration. So it takes roughly 500 years of Anderson spin up to get steady state pools. Whereas to do a direct integration takes about 5,000 years to get those same steady state pools. And the Anderson acceleration is getting the same answer as the direct integration spin up. So that's exciting. This is then for Toolik Lake. If you go north, you can run for 600 years and get the pools to equilibrate with Anderson, but after 6,000 years, the model still hasn't even reached that same steady state conditions yet. So it's roughly a 10x increase in our spin up capabilities. It does work with the Century style BGC, but this Anderson acceleration is much slower than the matrix spin up. So there's kind of pros and cons. The Anderson's extensible in the sense that you can use it with different soil biogeochemical models, but it isn't as efficient as the matrix spin up. So we're not using it for things like the PPE work, but it's a feature that's there and hopefully something that we can start building some more expertise with across both the ocean and land biogeochemistry. Okay, a little bit on unstructured grids. If you haven't downloaded and run any any simulations off of from CAM at all. They've switched grid, so we're using this NE30 grid, and this is actually what the grid structure looks like. So it's pretty different than the standard rectilinear grid. And if you NC dump that file, the dimensions of the file are timed by land grid, which is a little tricky to figure out how to plot. And so if you are running coupled model or F cases or anything that uses this NE30 grid, you've got some options. So one is you can embrace UX array, which is a NCAR supported kind of optimization or application of X array type features, but for unstructured grid. So they have some nice plotting capabilities, which is what this was done with. You can also regrid this unstructured grid to a regular lat long grid. Regridding is a real pain, I've learned in the last few months. And so the CESM post-processing tools, or Cupid, which Tegan will talk about some tomorrow, we're bringing in some regridding tools into Cupid that'll allow you to go from this unstructured grid to a regular lat long grid, and it's pretty efficient, which is exciting. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But then the diagnostics from Cupid also are, I would say, rapidly evolving. And so this, to me, is really exciting. I've just taken the ADF, the Atmosphere Diagnostics Framework, and basically reworked it to do land type plots. And so this is a look at Arctic LAI from two different, whatever, case 122 and 123 from the coupled model run. So these are all plotted with UX array on the native grid. And you can do things like polar plots or global plots, and then you get seasonal plots out of the KM diagnostics. I'm happy to run through a whole bunch of diagnostics with folks. But this totally would not have happened without Cupid. So Tegan and Mike get a ton of, I apologize, Tegan, I misspelled your name on that slide. But their leadership has been really important here. And Justin is, and the rest of the ADF team have put together a pretty nice package that, without a ton of effort, I was able to adapt for land things. So this is something that's growing and that we could use more help on. Okay, last little bit here, I wanted to talk about timelines. There's a lot happening between April of 2025 and the summer of 2025 on this figure, but I'm also excited that this is kind of where we look like, this is what we look like now for a CESM3 timeline. It's much shorter than it has been in the past. So we have all our science capabilities in the model. Those have been in roughly since September. We're waiting for final forcings from CMIP. Once we have those, then we'll start spin up. And I think spin up for the Ocean BGC is going to take a couple months because Anderson acceleration isn't working. And so they've got to use direct integration to spin up ocean tracers and the tracers in the ocean model. And while they're doing that, we're planning on doing a bunch of testing, documentation, and then simulations with the aim of having a CESM3 release at some point between summer of 25 and January of 26. That date's, I would say, fuzzy. And then scenarios are supposed to be available in January 26. So that's, I don't know if Dave, if there's any updates to this from the last couple of weeks, but this is kind of what we're looking like. And then also starting this summer, that's when hopefully the CMIP7 deck and fast track simulations will really get off the ground, especially the PI control. Okay. And with that, since Felix isn't here, I'm fine to push the discussion back a little bit. But I'm curious if anyone online has questions, ideas, or thoughts about new directions beyond CMIP7. I don't know, Paul, if you guys can let us see the chat in here. And so if you're on, oh, there's all kinds of stuff. I don't know if anyone's been, probably no one in here on the chat. I've been watching. Oh, well, has there been anything online that you've seen?
There was a question about if GSWP3 was still getting updated, but they kind of answered. The main thing is the screen seems to be cut off in like It's cut off at the right and stretched. That was most of this discussion.
Most of it, okay.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. Yeah, Meg.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious. So, Will, you were mentioning that the offline land runs look super different than the coupled runs, and so tuning
Yep.
parameters is an issue. Is that something that's happened in previous development cycles too, and it's just more pronounced this time, or is this like a new thing?
Good question. I think previous development cycle, this is my like off the cuff answer. I don't really know because this is my first go around really paying attention to it. But as far as I know, we haven't had different land only and coupled model parameterizations that we've supported. And I don't know how much of that is because we've always had a model that had a good ENSO. So if you have a good ENSO, you get a lot of, the droplets look okay, basically, and then the carbon cycle looks okay. I don't know if that's accurate. Kind of looking to.
Yeah, it's always been different
It has
between
been
coupled and land
It's
only.
been different, but like the results have been different. But the parameterization hasn't been different.
No, the parameterization's been the same. In fact, we introduced that land tuning mode last time in anticipation of potentially having to use it to have different parameter values, but in the end, we didn't do it, partly for the same reason that we might have this time, which is you run out of time to calibrate two models.
Right.
And then the idea last time was that we might just try to calibrate on things that were really sensitive, like fire. So we wouldn't get really wacky fire and then let everything else go. Because as we've discussed, it's hard to justify calibrating to a biased climate. Right. We've had lots of discussions about this. So, and I'll just say, I don't know that it's actually I don't know it's that the ENSO is wrong, which is a problem with the precip. It might be, but I thought it might have been more like the tropical Atlantic SSTs. Isla probably knows more than I do, but and there's the hypothesis of interhemispheric gradients. Whatever it is, it's a worse problem now, I think, than we've had in the past, and hopefully it's getting resolved.
Yeah.
Regarding the GWP3 forcing data set and comparison between the coupled and offline simulations. So I understand GWP3 was originally developed for the offline land model in Jankomas project area 3. So how is the upcoming schedule for such a next phase of the offline model in the comparison project?
I have no idea.
You are developing.
I'm the nominal lead of that, but I'm not too much. But LMIP, the land modeling intercomparison project, which is the land only simulations, is part of the deck or whatever the fast track, so that we will have a simulation, and we need to provide a suggestion about what the best forcing data set is to use. And right now, there's nothing other than true JRA really available. So that's going to be the default unless something happens. I just sent another email to Hing Jun. I don't think the Error 5 is totally a dead. I don't know what the conversation you have with GoCon. I don't think you can use it out of the box, but we're making efforts to do the bias correction. I'm not sure if he's even upset with it even after bias correction, but if we can get an Error 5 version working, then that might be. But yeah, unfortunately, there's just no money to support this, so it's just not moving. The problem. It was a problem last year, it's still a problem this year. Yeah.
Yeah, and Rosie just noted in the chat in the past that Amazon was really overproductive, so we didn't really. It was okay. Now it's not as overproductive, and so it's dying if we don't water it. I should say the precip biases that we have in the Amazon are pretty big. Like you should be getting around 2,500 millimeters of precip, and we're getting half that. So it's not surprising that the Amazon doesn't look good when you don't water it. Cool. All right, I think in the interest of time, we should move on and let Meg present. Paul, this one's online. I thought she was going to be here, but it's online. Do you want me to do anything on this side? Or do you guys come in? And Meg, are you still around?
I am. Yeah, I can share my screen. I think if you can stop sharing. Or I can do. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, cool. Well, not if I change slides. Okay, sorry to miss you all in person today. It sounds a lot more fun to be in the Mesa lab, but I'm homesick, so hopefully I'll join you tomorrow. I did want to take some time to think about the ways in which we're looking at the limited role of land on atmospheric predictability in CSM2. So going back to the previous version of the model, I want to especially thank my co-authors, Paul Dermeyer, who's online, who contributed a lot to this work, as well as the SPAT S2S team. So if you haven't heard about this, it's the NCAR Earth System Predictability Across Timescales initiative. And we have a team working on land-atmosphere interactions on S2S predictability in particular. So a huge shout out to that team. I like to kind of start big picture and think about why we care about this. So land surface anomalies have a really big impact on the overlying atmosphere. Soil moisture differences, whether they're wet or dry, can drive changes in surface fluxes, atmospheric circulation, and subsequent precipitation, and that's well documented in the literature. And those impacts can extend to extremes like droughts and floods. One of the ways that we think about kind of this chain of interactions is through something called the local coupling process chain, or LOCO. I think most people are familiar with this, but if not, the idea here is that if you have an anomaly in soil moisture near the surface, that can drive differences in evaporative fraction, which can then impact the planetary boundary layer, or kind of the near surface turbulent layer in the atmosphere. That leads to difference in precipitation in clouds, and then alterations in near surface temperature and moisture. So it's kind of a complicated process to go from an anomaly in soil moisture to things like droughts and floods being impacted, but it's possible. Now, given all of the information we have so far, it was expected that soil moisture gives you a key source of predictability at S2S timescales. And so this is a figure adapted from Paul Dermeyer, and it shows up in figure 1 of Yaga's paper in 2024. The idea here is that if you look at 2-meter temperature predictability through time, in the first few weeks, you would expect the atmosphere to play a big role. The next few weeks, the land should dominate, and then out at longer timescales, 6 weeks plus, you would see more information coming from the ocean itself. Now, when Yaga and others conducted a series of experiments looking at this in CSM, concerningly, that's not the picture that was found. So instead, we get a lot of predictability skill coming from the atmosphere, even out to say 5 weeks, but very little comes from the land. That's this green line here. Even land atmosphere interactions, which is the dashed line, is ultimately really limited. And so that's what kind of spurred this SPAT initiative to try and understand what exactly is happening. So the question we're trying to answer is if deficiencies in simulated land atmosphere coupling explain the limited impact of land initialization that we saw in CSM. I'm going to preface this by saying it's a work in progress, so I don't actually have an answer for you today, but I think we're getting some interesting results so far. So in order to look at this, I want to highlight a couple of simulations we have as options. So there is the existing CSM 2.1.5 S2S hindcast, which went into the Richter et al. Paper. I'm not going to show you those today, but I think they're an interesting resource to mine further, and that's something we're working on within the SPAT group. We also have climatological AMIP runs, so land and atmosphere active, ocean is climatological, and we're using the same model configuration as was used for the hindcast. So we have 25 years of simulations to get a sense of what's happening climatologically for land atmosphere interactions. We have a control simulation, which just uses the default parameter settings within that CSM version. We also have a sensitivity experiment where we've increased the strength of land atmosphere coupling by kind of going in and tuning a CLM parameter and just making that lead to enhanced coupling. To validate each of our model simulations, we're mostly looking at tower observations, in particular from FluxNet 2015, also from Ameriflux, looking at soil moisture and sensible heat flux, and then as possible, I am looking at ARIFI reanalysis as well. So to kind of dive in, you can take 2 approaches to understanding if land atmosphere interactions are part of the problem. One option is that it's a land-based problem. So we wanted to ask how well does CSM capture the impact of soil moisture on surface flux anomalies? So kind of that lower part of the LOCO diagram I showed you before. So in order to assess this, what we're going to look at is the terrestrial coupling index. Essentially, it measures how sensitive a response variable is to variations in a driving variable. So in this case, the driving variable would be soil moisture, the response variable would be sensible heat flux. And if you want more information, there's a lot of studies out there, but I'll point you to Paul's 2011 paper in particular. So in our control simulation, what this looks like is that we have, this is in boreal summer, June, July, and August. So we have relatively strong land atmosphere coupling, where we have darker colors, meaning that you have a strong negative relationship. So a negative soil moisture anomaly drives a positive anomaly in sensible heat flux. And then each of these dots is observations from a FluxNet tower. And so you can kind of get a sense of where things are performing well versus where they're performing maybe not so well. What we've done then is taken our sensitivity experiment where we artificially turned up the strength of coupling. And the good news is that it seems to work in the sense that there's a lot more dark blue on the map on the left versus the map on the right. If you look, for example, at Australia, things look quite different. Throughout the central US, things look quite different. But interestingly, this is just one error metric, but if you look at the RMSE between the stronger coupling case and the default case, it looks like we're doing a better job in our default CSM simulation. So at least initially, having stronger land atmosphere coupling is not giving us a more realistic picture. So the initial indication then is that maybe the terrestrial coupling leg is not the culprit for limited land-based predictability. Not that necessarily it's great. I mean, we still had a relatively high RMSE, but that might not be the full picture. So the second thing I want to look at is more atmospheric based. So how sensitive is the atmosphere to variations in surface fluxes? So I'm going to introduce kind of a new metric that I'm looking at lately. It's developed a number of years ago by Kirsten Findell. The idea here is that we're looking at a convective triggering potential, CTP, and a humidity index at low levels. So CTP you can kind of think of as CAPE. It's a measure of how much energy the atmosphere has to kind of respond to surface forcing. And the humidity index tells you how much moisture there is. So we look at pre-morning conditions, and then we kind of assign it to a category here on the right. So I've outlined these in different colors. The idea here is that if it's outlined in blue, this is an atmospherically controlled situation. So if the CTP is negative, it's too stable in the atmosphere to really produce rain. And then given the humidity index, we can get a situation where either, again, it's too dry for rain or so wet that it's going to rain, whether it's dry or wet soils. So again, it's atmospherically controlled. But then there's this fun area in the middle where if you have a relatively lower but not too low humidity index, you would expect precipitation to occur over wet soils, so kind of a positive feedback loop. And then above that, you would expect more of a negative feedback loop. So you would expect precipitation to occur over dry soils instead. What we can do then is map this onto, say, the US, given daily, sub-daily information. So here I'm looking at ERA 5, despite its biases, we see that mostly in the Western US, we have an atmospherically controlled situation where either the atmosphere is too stable to produce precipitation, or there's just not enough humidity or too much humidity. And then interestingly, the western half of the US is where things are kind of more exciting from a land-based perspective. So dry soils might lead to precipitation in the Midwest, and wet soils might lead to precipitation along the eastern coast. So we can then compare that to what we see with CSM2. And these pictures are somewhat different. I've highlighted a couple of those just with circles. The idea here, sorry, missing a circle, is that there's big differences in the Midwest. So CSM2 is suggesting that more locations are atmospherically controlled than they might be sensitive to land conditions. So that may be one impact where we're seeing land initialization not really matter to the atmosphere. It's also true in the region of the North American monsoon. So maybe there's something process-based that's just not quite happening accurately. And when I presented this at the Earth System Predictability Workshop, I think Katie made a really good point. There's also some interesting things happening up here in the Northeast that we don't really see as much happening in CSM2. So there are differences happening from an atmospheric side as well. So far I've shown you kind of a land-based perspective looking at moisture responses and fluxes, and an atmospheric perspective where the atmosphere is either sensitive or not to surface fluxes. But the whole idea is to actually look at the full process chain. And as you may have guessed from the local process chain that I showed you before, that can be kind of difficult and complicated. So I'm going to try, and this is kind of a set of crazy diagrams, totally understand. So I'll try and walk you through this slowly. The idea here is that these are pipe diagrams that Paul's made this is looking at Ameriflex towers at one site here in the Midwest. We're looking basically at a coupling strength between each of these boxes. So again, we're looking at, say, the driver is surface soil moisture. How much does variability in surface soil moisture drive variance in evaporative fraction? And so that would be this kind of very, very pale link that you can't really see happening here near the surface. The link width is proportional to the coupling index magnitude. And if it's a dashed blue line, it indicates the links are severed. And so the direction isn't really making sense. So for example, here, a sensible heat anomaly is leading to a negative 2 meter temperature anomaly. We would expect them to be in the same direction. So that link is severed. What we can then do is kind of expand this out. This is where things get really complicated. So we have Ameriflex as our tower observations. We have ERA 5 as a reanalysis product that typically we would use as kind of a proxy for observations. And then we have our CSM2 simulations at this grid cell as well. And there are a lot of differences. So if you just take a big step back and you look at these three panels, you might say, huh, those don't look exactly the same. So some of the interesting things that are popping out, if we start near the bottom and we look at surface soil moisture, the variability is too weak. And so you can kind of get this from how darkly colored the box is. So we have kind of this nice mint green here in CSM versus a very dark navy blue in ERA 5 and a medium color in Ameriflex. That means that we have really high variability in ERA 5, medium variability in Ameriflex site, and low variability here in CSM2, which might be driving some of those differences we're seeing. Conversely, the sensible heat flux variability is actually too strong in CSM. So even though the anomalies that we're getting in soil moisture are too weak, we're getting too strong anomalies in sensible heat flux in CSM, whether we compare it against the Ameriflex station or ERA 5 reanalysis. And if we look at kind of the links that happen between them, I think it's really interesting to note that CSM indicates overly strong positive links between soil moisture and evaporative fraction. So we have this kind of wide red line here going between the two. It's much thinner in ERA 5, and it's almost non-existent in Ameriflex. There are, of course, issues when you try to compare a station against a gridded product, which I think is important to note, but important to note all the same. The link between evaporative fraction and 2 meter temperature is too strong, and it's also too strong between 2 meter humidity. And so again, that's just these kind of two links here. It's the opposite side and a severed link in Ameriflex. And if we go all the way up the process chain and we look at the link between moist enthalpy and total cloud cover, this is pretty strong in CSM, maybe overstated relative to what we see in ERA 5 and Ameriflex. So pretty much anywhere along the process chain, you could pick out something that's a little suspicious and deserves further investigation. And that's kind of the step that we're at right now. There are a lot of potential biases within land-atmosphere interactions, whether it's a bias originating in the land model or the atmosphere model or somewhere in the interaction between the two. And ideally, we want to look across climate regimes. So those pipe diagrams I showed you were just at a single site and at a single season, no less. So it's important to look at a bigger picture to get a sense of what's happening. We're developing tools to do this right now, which I think is really exciting, and we're investigating which metrics are most useful. So hopefully within the next year, we'll have more results. But right now, our goal is to continue to assess the process chain from surface anomalies to atmospheric responses and identifying potential biases across locations. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is identify new parameterizations or tunings that might improve land-atmosphere coupling within CSM2 and really use those to assess more accurately what the impact is of land initialization on predictability. So that will involve leveraging case studies, looking across models. So Zheng and Sunlin here are looking at this in the NOAA MP model. And hopefully we can start learning from each other with just enhanced communication. And with that, I will thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Meg.
I think
Cesar had his hand up. Cesar, can you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
I can't hear Cesar online.
Cesar, if it's easier, you can just put your question in the chat. Any other questions for Meg?
Thanks for the nice talk. So your conclusion about the link between, I think it was soil moisture and evaporative fraction being wrong, I forget in which sense. Is that just at one site, or do you think that's a general thing?
Yeah, so this is kind of my challenge. This is at one site right now. I think that I feel like you've done work in the Southwest where it looks good. And it could, so my guess is that this is really highly regional. Maybe in the Midwest, it's more of a problem than in the Southwest, but I think we need to look more broadly. The other thing I would note is that 2-meter humidity is another link I looked at, which did look quite different between CSM and ERA 5, which might be related, but I think there's issues with the ERA 5 2-meter humidity, so I'm hesitant to believe that offhand. So if you have a good observational product for fluxes or soil moisture, we should chat.
Yeah, that's weird. The Ameriflex chart doesn't show any relationship at all. A little suspicious. And then in the CSM2, you have to remember that there's climate biases. And is this a Midwest site? Is this ARM?
Yeah. It's
That's like a massive dry bias in CSM2. So it could just be in the wrong regime, too dry, and therefore too sensitive to. So it may not be a process problem. So it means just to add to the number of things that could be wrong. Mean state problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's one that more and more we're kind of starting to think about in the SPAC group. It's like, okay, well, the soil moisture biases, the flux biases, the precip biases, how do you take all the mean state biases and put them together? Yeah, it's worth considering.
I'll just note in the chat, Paul Dermeyer said that ERA 5 humidity is poor due to their data assimilation process, kind of echoing what you're saying there, Meg.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Also gives me pause for wanting to use ERA 5 out of the box.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested to hear more about that because I've found ERA 5 to compare really well with the station data because it's assimilating the station data. I guess I'm about to do a talk entirely using ERA 5 humidity.
Yeah, I would invite Paul to weigh in on that. I think Paul knows more.
You want to unmute, Paul?
Yeah, I was typing furiously, but I'll just talk. It's the variability in humidity that's kind of missing entirely in ERA 5. They fit the means pretty well, but they still do that mafoofery, as Pierce Sellers used to call it, where they use the soil moisture as a tuning knob to get their temperature and humidity biases down. And they got rid of some of that when they started assimilating soil moisture from remote sensing, but they didn't get rid of all of it. They still left that in. And so their humidity variability is really dead in most places over land from day to day. And I apologize for the pipe diagrams being so complicated. It's basically a map of my brain, so it's just a mess.
They're really cool, though. It's really fun to look at.
All right, any other questions for Meg? Great, thanks, Meg.
Thanks.
All right, next is Nazine. Continue the land atmosphere interactions. And for speakers in the room, you get to get mic'd up. And when you put the mic on, it needs to be pointing straight up towards your mouth. I'll let you do it. That's good for you.
Hello.
Yeah. Here you go.
And good morning, everyone. And today I will present my work. And titled as Validation of CSM Land Atmosphere Coupling Using Observationally Derived Metrics. This study was conducted in collaboration with Dr. Paul Diermeyer and was supported by NASA grants. To set a stage for this study, let's look at a famous map adopted from Custer et al. 2004, which shows the global distribution of LA coupling metrics between soil moisture and precipitation using the ensemble mean of 12 GCM model during the boreal summer. The high value of this metric in these regions, and these regions referred to as the hotspot regions, you can see some chart bars that these bars are the area average of this metric over these hotspot regions by each of these individual models. So based on this, you can see that the models disagree on the strength of coupling metrics in hotspot regions. So we don't know which model is correct. And also the results only can be validated locally at flux tower site. And the problem with this flux tower site or in situ measurement is their limited global distribution and short duration. So making it challenging to validate the results on the global scale. So this highlights the need for the global observationally based dataset for assessing the results of the models. So now that I have outlined the gap that we have in complete picture of reality of global LA coupling for model validation, Tavakkoli and Diermeyer produced a global corrected LA coupling metrics from observationally gridded data while accounting for the observational random errors in soil moisture satellite measurement. So what do I mean by corrected observational metrics? We can quantify the magnitude of stochastic random errors in soil moisture time series by knowing the fact that soil moisture behave like a first order Markov process. So the autocorrelation function decreases exponentially as lag grows. So if we have a soil moisture time series that has a random error, and if we fitted the line through the logarithm of ACF, this line won't cross the zero. There is a displacement that this displacement is related to the variance of the random error. And all these are explained in this paper. And if you're interested to know more about this work, I would be happy to discuss it with you after my presentation. And so now that we have this corrected observational gridded LA coupling, we conducted a comparison, a comprehensive comparison between these metrics and model-based estimates. And why it is important? Because based on this study, we can identify global regimes and hotspots for LA interactions in model, and also highlight the regions where the model biases are most pronounced, and interpret the special patterns and seasonal variations in coupling metrics, and ultimately our results can provide guidance for model development. So the metrics in this study are categorized into the main two groups. The first group is soil moisture metrics, which focuses on soil moisture memory, regime distribution, and breakpoints. We only focus on wilting point and critical soil moisture. And the second group is bivariate metrics between soil moisture and surface fluxes, like in correlation, and from this we can derive coupling index, which quantifies the coupling between land and atmosphere. So because I don't have that much time to explain all of these metrics in detail, I will only focus on soil moisture memory, regime distribution, and correlation. So what do I mean by regime distribution? This figure shows the connection between evaporative fraction and soil moisture, and by identifying the wilting point and critical soil moisture, we can define the regimes. For example, below the wilting point, that EF is really close to the zero, regardless of soil moisture level, we are in the dry regime. And between the wilting point and critical soil moisture, there is a strong correlation between EF and soil moisture, we are in a transitional regime. And both of these are known as a water limited regime. But above the critical soil moisture, that EF reaches a plateau. that the availability of energy is now controlling the evaporation rather than the availability of water. We are in a wet regime. So what I have done in this study, I fitted 6 potential regression model to the scatter plot of EF and soil moisture. And then based on Bayesian information criteria, I found the most likely model at each grid cell. And in this panel, you can see these models with their code name and their shape. And this table summarizes the data set that I use in this study. For soil moisture, I use SMAP and CCI, which are the satellite measurements from surface soil moisture. And also, I use SOMO.ml. This is a machine learning data set which provide soil moisture for different layers. And then the surface fluxes are coming from GLIM version 4. So each pair of these soil moisture were combined with GLIM, and then a corrected coupling index has been calculated as observational metrics. And then I use AMIP simulation and CLM model as and then I calculated the metrics, and all these calculations were conducted at the spatial resolutions of model, and the time coverage has been aligned with the observations. Let's move on to the results section and start with the soil moisture memory. This figure shows differences in soil moisture memory derived from CCI and CLM in top panel, and CCI versus AMIP in bottom panel during the JJA. So the brown are the areas that the models are overestimating soil moisture memory, and blue are the areas that the model is underestimating soil moisture memory compared to the CCI. And we can see that in most part of North Africa, Sahel, and Middle East, and northern part of Australia, and some part of South America, the model is having longer soil moisture memory compared to the CCI. And these locations are very similar in both CLM and AMIP. And most of these locations are monsoon areas. So this means that maybe there is a uncertainty in how the model is simulating monsoon rainfall variability, or timing of the monsoon, or even how the model is representing the soil top or the diffusion of the water in the soil. These are affecting the soil moisture memory. So I have shown you the comparison between CCI and the model. So let's see SOMO versus models and SMAP versus model during the JJA. So if you only focus on first column, CLM versus observations, you can see that these hotspot regions that model is overestimating soil moisture memory are very consistent across these observational data sets. Or even if you only focus on the AMIP and observation data set, you can see that these hotspots region are consistent. But there's a point here that their magnitude is different. Because the characteristic of these observational data sets is different from each other. And so this leads to variation in soil moisture memory. For example, SOMO has longer soil moisture memory in compared to the CCI and SMAP. So there is an uncertainty in the validation. But the point here is that the regions that the model is overestimating CCI is consistent. So this figure shows the correlation between soil moisture and evaporation during the JJA between the models and observations. So the gray are the areas that the model correlation is significantly different from observation correlation. And the non-gray are the areas that the model correlation is not significantly different from observational correlation. And they are showing the magnitude of the models. So what we can see that the gray areas are consistent across these observational data sets if you only focus on the first column. And also in AMIP, we can see that gray areas are consistent. And for example, in some regions like Australia or certain part of Africa or some part of high latitude, you can see that it seems that CLM correlation is not significantly different from the observations and compared to the AMIP, because in these locations are mostly gray in AMIP correlations. But we can see that, for example, in most part of central US or in over China or most part of the Sahel and Middle East, it seems that AMIP correlations is very close, not close, but it's not significantly different from observations, but these areas are gray in CLM. And finally, this figure is showing the global SMEF regime distribution. The top panel is observation and the bottom is model. So this figure shows the most likely candidate models. And what we can see that it seems that the models tends to go better in compared to the observations. There is a large differences over the North Africa, Australia, or western part of US, or even high latitude between models and observations. And it seems that the models are not capturing the dry regimes in compared to the observations. And one of the reasons can be because, for example, CLM has a strong capillarity action in compared to the observation, in compared to the reality. So whenever the surface soil gets dry, and if there is a moisture in this soil, it will come to the surface and it will get some evaporation. And because of maybe this is the reason that the models cannot capture dry regimes very well. So this is the preliminary results, and I'm still working on what is happening in the models. And the last thing that I want to discuss is checking whether the subsurface soil moisture is controlling evaporation or transpiration. So what I have done is that after I selected the most likely model candidate in layer 1 and layer 3. Layer 1 is from 0 to 10 centimeter and layer 3 is from 30 to 50 centimeter. Then I calculated the RMSE between the predicted and the actual values. After that, this ratio, which shows the differences between RMSE at layer 3 and layer 1, has been calculated. So what can we understand from this ratio? If this ratio is negative, it means that when you are going to the deep to the soil, the fitting is improving. So the subsurface soil moisture is controlling it and transpiration. We have deeply rooted vegetation. But if this ratio is positive, so means that the feed was better at the surface than compared to the deeper soil. We are in the bare soil and we have evaporation. So I have calculated this ratio for SOMO top panel and AMIP in the bottom panel. And we can see that the positive of this ratio, the brown are very, we can see in the dry regime very well, although the signal is more in the AMIP in compared to the SOMO. But the point here is that we cannot see much of green and the negative of this ratio or the transpiration in SOMO. And we can see some parts that are green in AMIP, but they are not tropical forests. They are mostly agricultural regions or savanna or grassland. We cannot see much of this green in western part of US or China. So this slide is showing the conclusion of this study, and thank you, and here is my contact information.
Great. Any questions? Online makes an excellent talk. Really. Yeah, Sean.
For your point number 6 there, how would you assess that, from an observational standpoint? Do you have?
So when we compare, the Middle East and North, this part,
It's hard to get used to, yeah.
so, when you look at this part, the North Africa and Middle East, between the model and the observations, you can see that lots of purple and blue. If you see this code name, the purple are transitional regime, and the blue are transitional and wet regime. We cannot see much of yellow or cyan color, which are showing the dry and transitional regimes in the, for example, over the Australia or Middle East or northern part of Africa, and even western part of US.
I think maybe he was asking like, how can you show that it's the capillary rise? That's just a hypothesis, right?
Yes, this is the hypothesis. Because this, even in soil moisture memory, these areas are having longer soil moisture memory than observations. So it means that the models tends to go better compared to the observation.
Is there anything in like the PPE that would let us play around with the flashiness of soil hydraulic properties?
Maybe if we can come up with metrics, we can try to test them in the PPE space. So feel free to pass us metrics.
Yeah. Or like Daniel, is this something that you were able to look at in your one at a time? I know that wasn't really the focus of.
Not explicitly, no. Or it happened for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see in the PPE space if you could produce models that could get better regimes, or is it like a missing process, right?
Or being downstream, or on the back end of forcing too. If the forcing doesn't have the right variability to it, then you can't change that signal overly.
Paul, can you just unmute?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in that we think these are
Hang on a
connected.
second, Paul, we can't, it looks like you're talking, but we can't hear you right now.
I'm
yeah.
unmuted.
Now
There
we
we
got
go.
you.
All right. Had to click it another extra time. Yeah, we think this might be connected to some of what, Meg has shown, that if the model soil moisture, regardless of its absolute value, is not in the right regime, then it's not going to feed back on the atmosphere correctly, because you need to be in that sensitive regime in order to have a feedback. Otherwise, you don't have it. So getting this right might help getting the rest of it right. That's kind of a working hypothesis.
There's another question from Sanjeev online. He said, great talk. Gleam also has soil moisture. Is there any reason you didn't use Gleam soil moisture?
So I plan to use it, compare Gleam soil moisture and surface fluxes, but right now I haven't done that.
Great. Any other thoughts on soil moisture? All right, we are well ahead of schedule, which is nice that we can have a long